Greg Casey joins me this week to discuss the history of American lager. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 248. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 248, and it's early December 2021. Greg Casey joins me this week to discuss the rich history of American lagers. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. And also the Brew Commander, the new brewhouse controller from Blickman Engineering. It's available in electric and gas propane models. The patent-pending Brew Commander is a high-quality brewhouse controller that offers automated step mashing, boil timers, precision temperature control, and advanced settings. Command your brew day with the new Brew Commander. To order yours today, visit blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's blickmanengineering.com. And finally, I'm happy to say the web-based version of BeerSmith is available now at beersmithrecipes.com. BeerSmith for the web lets you build, edit, and brew recipes from any browser, including your desktop, tablet, or mobile device. The new web version gives you access to tens of thousands of recipes, online recipe editing, advanced water tools, and much more. You can try BeerSmith Web for 30 days by setting up an account at beersmithrecipes.com. If you purchase a Gold, Platinum, or Pro license, you get both BeerSmith Web and the desktop version of BeerSmith for one low price. Check out beersmithrecipes.com now to give BeerSmith Web a try. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Dr. Greg Casey. Greg holds a PhD in applied microbiology from the University of Saskatchewan and has held academic positions as well as positions with Anheuser-Busch, Red Star Yeast, Stroh Brewery, and Coors. He was also president of the American Society of Brewing Chemists from 2005 to 2006. And I think, Greg, now you said you're retired, right?
Yeah, I retired back in 2013, and well done on the Saskatchewan. Most people sort of stumble through that one, so well done.
Yeah. I spent some time in Canada. I think you're from Toronto, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Well, it's great to have you on the show. How did you get interested in the history of American lagers as a topic? Because most people don't really dive into that very much.
No, that's a good point. It's like, why delve into, a style of beer that's kind of going against the current interest in craft styles, for example, is obviously well-deserved. And why would somebody delve into what took place 100 years ago, even longer? What sparked my interest was related to a job-related event. I had roles in research as well as quality assurance, and typically, with caustic contamination, a sodium test is something that we always used to refer to in case we suspected the caustic wasn't rinsed out of the tank. And so I did a Google search for adulteration. Seeing if there was any, more definitive test methods, more objective, right? Well, not more objective, but different than the sodium test, which requires a process survey and capability of knowing what normal levels are, et cetera. And then I saw a hit for the Turner Adulteration Bill, and it was 1890, and I opened it up, and that's what started what is now a 14-year journey and nearly 17,000 primary period references into the debate in American society, particularly in the decades, a half century before Prohibition, over the simple question of what is beer. And I got hooked. And I've always had an interest in history. I asked Bill Coors if he'd ever heard of the controversial nature of the use of corn and rice in the 1800s, and he said he had no idea. So I figured Bill didn't know. Nobody did. So, and in retirement, you're always looking for something to fill in those years with a passion, right? So for me, I decided, okay, I got to tell this story. I'm going to write this story. And, maybe towards the end, this is not for profit. I won't make a penny out of this, but it's a passion. And it combines my passion of brewing with the history of the United States.
That's very cool. Why did you dive into American lager though? In particular, is that, it wasn't the dominant style until like the mid 1800s, right?
It's Genesis. The all malt lager started the 1840s, and then the pilsner from 1870s on. And the pilsner was, the one that was overwhelmingly made with adjuncts, because that was the beer of the period. in terms of lager, that's where the research took me. By the last decades of the 19th century, the overwhelming majority, the vast majority of the beer sold in the United States of America was adjunct lager beer, pilsner style. And so the context was that. And all the debate was focused on lager. I really didn't. They were using adjuncts and ales too, but just mostly in the northeast part of the United States. But overwhelmingly, it was a lager world, and it was adjunct lager that made beer, as they repeatedly called it in the press, America's national beverage, adjunct lager beer.
And I mean, we discount it today, but a lot of American lager is still the dominant form of beer right here in the United States.
Yeah, I kind of touch on this in the first volume because I don't want to say I'm being a little bit flippant, but I'm kind of like, well, it's still 80% of this. Craft is 20-ish or something like that, and adjunct, domestic, and imported as a style, it's still there. But on a global basis, I mean, it's waxing. It's still growing. I used to lecture in China, and Snow Lager, the world's most popular style of beer. It was like, to me, it tastes like a Miller Genuine Draft. But adjunct lager beer, particularly, reflective of, if you associate that with the United States in terms of, setting the hook as a permanent style, so many countries have adopted our beer, is the way I look at it. Canada in particular. I never thought growing up I'd see Bud and Coors Light as the top two brands of beer in Canada. Well, they are, and so yeah, as a style, it's still got legs globally, but domestically, it's been chipped away at. But like I said, as a style, 80% is still pretty good.
And I mean, it's really the dominant style worldwide, isn't it? Almost.
It is. On a global basis, and I have a table in the first volume showing that, the top 20, top 25 brands of beer in the world. I think virtually all but one of them. And Heineken, just because they went back to all malt. They used to be adjunct brewers, but they changed that policy a number of years ago. But adjunct lager beers, you bet, they're the dominant style. And confirmation of this, it was a friend of mine in Dumans in Munich. And I was sitting around the fire pit with him the other year. He was here for a CBC in Denver. And, I was telling him, I said, a lot of folks say American beer doesn't have any history, doesn't have any, roots. It's being developed now. And he chastised me. He said, well, how could you say that? He said, we Dumans just did a global survey of the most popular styles of beer in the world. And he said, it is your beer. Is adjunct lager beer? That's the beer of the world. So how could you say you have no history and or no culture of beer, if you will? You may not like the style, but in terms of just raw numbers and consumers making purchasing decisions, it's a style that was perfected here and has been adopted by the world.
So, I mean, that's pretty amazing. So American lager arguably is the world's most popular beer style. And even though we look down upon it, right? We kind of look down our nose on it as craft beer enthusiasts. Yep. We kind of ignore the American beer heritage, really, which goes back, some 160 years here, right?
Yeah, and I have a real passion for this comes out in the first volume. I got a whole chapter called just entitled "Jokes and Critics." It's the Rodney Dangerfield of beer styles, right? Don't get no respect, and I get that. It's having on the technical side, seeing how difficult it is to make, I have respect for it. But on the consumer side, I realize, well, there's not a lot to it. It's pretty subtle compared to every other style of beer in the world. But what we have, I have a real passion in the book to draw attention to the fact that, and I used you a golfer, Brad, but the Masters, the green jacket, right? Germany has a green jacket with their name on it. Belgium does, and England, but the United States, we don't have that jacket. We don't have dibs to a history or a culture of contributing to the global beer community. And I think it's a pity that we've lost, or we don't have that sense, not just within the industry, but within the American public as a whole. And I think we're giving to the wine industry and distilling industry sort of bragging rights for having an American heritage and American culture as an industry. And I think if people knew how hard it was fought for, because that's one thing people respect, is something that is fought for and defended, and the underdog against overwhelming forces. And remarkably, that's the story of American adjunct lager beer. So I really, really, really hope that what comes out of this trilogy is an awareness that there is a green jacket which says the United States of America. It's just that it's adjunct lager beer, not the styles of Belgium, Germany, and England.
Now, where does the American lager story really begin?
It really that's it's kind of a little bit lost in the mystery of time or the of history, the fog of history. But I believe it was just in the late 1830s, certainly by the early 1840s, 41, 42. There's in most overwhelmingly in Pennsylvania, but there's also literature that said it could have been in Cincinnati and other cities where German communities were at the time. But that was the start of lager in the United States. Everything up to that point in time was ale porters and stouts, but really just an infinitesimally small part of the overall alcoholic beverage category in the United States. And it was an all malt. It was a Dunkel style. It was brewed for the German community by German brewers. It didn't expand to you Americans, and I'll maybe talk about that in a minute. You know, the non-German, the non-Deutsch, non-Deutschman or Dutchman. But by the 1870s, that is when Pilsner exploded across the Western world. It wasn't just a United States thing, but Pilsner, spread out across the world. Helles and Bavaria was a recognition of that. But everywhere in the Western world, Pilsner evolved. And that was 1870s in the United States when it hit here, and that's the beer that took beer from virtually nothing as an overall category to a per capita at a time when the population was massively expanding, right? It became the beer of all Americans, not just the German communities. But 1870s, that's when it really, really started, the Pilsner, and specifically the use of adjuncts.
So, I mean, what drove that? What made this beer style that was, kind of small and in a lot of German American communities explode into the dominant style that we have today?
That's a really good question, Brad. And definitely there's so much of American culture that really influenced the evolution of it as a style that didn't happen in other countries. For example, Americans, we typically like to drink, and this is, this kind of knowledge is found in the transcripts of the hearings, Senate hearings and House hearings about why do you use adjuncts. I'm not making this up. In the book, you see the actual quotes.
Right.
They talk about and I had to look up some words. These guys are pretty sophisticated. The aesthetic as well as the Epicurean values of adjunct lager beer. And I'm like, what the hell is that? Epicurean. Well, that's the part. How it tastes, but the aesthetics, how it looked, and that was a major factor. Pilsner was an easier style to drink for one thing. And their Germans talk about when they visited here in the 19th century, the rush style of Americans, that we are an anxious people compared to, German culture, German society. But we didn't need beer for nutrition. We used it for refreshment. And, they visiting Germans say it pained them to watch an American, how quickly they would quaff a beer, but they were quaffing a beer in a glass. It was a glass and you could see the beer. In Germany, beer gardens, you're typically drinking out of steins. You didn't see it. There was an expression, Americans drink beer with their eyes, Germans drink beer with their tongues. And that was an expression said in right around 1900. And that really captures why in the United States, we wanted a beer that was crystal clear when it was ice cold, right or wrong, but that's how you start seeing ads for ice cold beer in the 1870s onwards. And only American brewers figured out two things: how to do it, to keep it crystal clear when it was ice cold, fresh, but also to shipping it to Arizona or any part of the United States of America several months later, it was still crystal clear when it was put on ice. And German after German after German expert from the 1890s to 1910s, they said no beer in Europe can do this. But the industry had a reason to be able to deliver that to their consumers, and that was the American preference.
Now, I don't know if this is true, but I was told that glassware, like clear glassware, was not commonly available to average people in the 1700s, for example. And it wasn't until the 1800s that you begin to have relatively cheap glassware available to the average person.
Yeah, that's my understanding. Pardon me, that's my understanding as well. But certainly by the last decades of the 19th century, glass was the ubiquitous serving container that was at the saloons. And, they obviously you could have growlers and things like that, but but most of the beer was consumed on site, on premise, as opposed to home use. That kind of was more of a later development in terms of the percentage, and the bottles were brown, so you didn't see it. But even with the brown beer bottles, you see it in their advertisement. pour it into a glass and see if it's clear. This is chill proof. The term chill proof was repeatedly referred to in ads in the 1910s, on 1900s and 1910s, those 2 decades.
And I believe the dominant styles before this were primarily English styles, right? Things like
100%.
porters and browns, right?
India pale ales. But the thing that really saw those disappear from the American scene, not disappear totally, of course, but they're being revived now. But they were higher alcohol, for example. Mm-hmm. I mean, in terms of being able to preserve and have a stable product to give to consumers, they were less quaffable, if you will. I mean, they were a style that just didn't suit the overall population as the explosion of immigration in the last decades of the 19th century. So it just they just dropped off the radar screen, and it was kind of fascinating to see. I didn't realize that, and again, it was a tiny fraction when you compare it to rum, Madeira, whiskey, and everything else. We needed prohibition. We were a pretty naughty nation, in terms of, and the Germans kept reinforcing, hey, trust us, drink lager. You're not going to get drunk all the time. But even when lager came, even in the 1860s, the Union Army, right at the start of the Civil War, for a number of months, allowed lager beer to be consumed by the troops in camp as they considered it non-alcoholic. So low in alcohol, relatively speaking, to the ales, porters, and stouts. But then, it didn't take long for a couple of generals to go, hey, I think these guys can drink enough of this but for a few months, and there was a big debate in society and the New York Times newspapers, is lager beer intoxicating? That low alcohol, relatively speaking, compared to, so you could quaff it, you could refresh it, you can drink more of it. It just had so many advantages to the American people at that time and like I said, it expanded. They kept saying in their testimony defending it, you Americans, we make an all malt beer for us, but you Americans, meaning, multi-generational citizens of every ethnicity, demand it.
Now, can you go back and talk about the German influence here in the origins of American lager? And it's interesting. I think we were talking before the show, but we often think of Germany and the Reinheitsgebot and the purity laws and so on, but those didn't come until later, right?
Yeah, it's an important point because in the second volume, which I've written, but it's not been published, won't be published till John Palmer, my editor, gets through it for 2022. But I talk about the Reinheitsgebots, plural. Certainly Bavaria 1516 is the most famous, but Bavaria, when you look at the German Empire as a whole, the vast majority of the German population in the German Empire from 1871 onwards were free to use adjuncts. And that was, Prussia, all the other German states, duchies, Grand Dukes, whatever the hell they were. But most of Germany was using adjuncts right up until 1906, when in June 1906. And it's fascinating reading, and I talk about this in one of my MBA papers. The Reichstag made no bones about it. It was part of the imperial financial reforms of 1906 to fund the expansion of the German Empire's navy. And they didn't mince, it was a dramatic increase in the beer tax. They standardized it. They eliminated the categories that had existed since 1871 when Bismarck set up Germany as his first chancellor. We will tax rice. We will tax sugars. We will tax corn. We will tax syrups. We will tax malt. 1906, for the whole empire, it's just malt. All these other categories, particularly for lager, were eliminated. And it was a dramatic increase, and I don't see any evidence it was done for anything other than financial reasons, follows the money. But during that period then, the 1840s up to 1906, it's fascinating. German after German, when they're testifying, when asked, when did you first brew using rice, for example, they talk about breweries in Heidelberg or northern Germany, or they don't talk about Bavaria, but they were talking about other regions where it was quite commonly used, and they brought that expertise over with them. And it's just a really fascinating. It's a part of history we just don't. I didn't know anything about it. That this overlapping and the influence of so many German brewers had already been versed It wasn't something that Anton Schwartz, who's often associated as being the father of adjunct brewing, sort of introduced to America. No, that he was a disciple already of prophets in various institutions in Europe that were advocating the use of adjuncts, including potatoes, beet sugar, and rice.
So, I mean, ultimately, this style was started in Germany, right? And then
Absolutely.
carried over by German immigrants, right?
Yeah, I'd say, Brad, I'd say the 1850s. We've got documentation that as early as the 1850s, it preceded the use of adjuncts by about a decade or two in the United States. But there's this fascinating Ludwig von Haker, who's a professor in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who had a patent on the use of they called it Indian corn, but it was just corn, right? And he traveled to the United States in 1863, which, as you know, was kind of the height of the Civil War. And he stayed here 10, 11 months to promote his patent to brew using corn as an adjunct with American breweries. And about 8, 9 months ago, I just came across a book he wrote describing his experiences, and he names names, breweries, and he talks about being run out of in Indianapolis when the local German community got wind of that they're going to do some test brews with corn as an adjunct to brew lager. They literally got run out of town. But he also talks about breweries in virtually every state. East of the Mississippi, he went both north and south. He talks about, being a corn guy. He was distraught what he saw in terms of Union prisoners just being fed 1 cob of corn a day. There's a vibe. Little stories like that really kind of resonate with me. But so there was evidence even as early as 1863 that adjuncts were introduced here. But in terms of really taking off, it was 1870s here, 1850s in Germany.
Wow. What were some of the early American lagers like? Were they different than what we're drinking today?
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Like everything else in terms of fashion and evolution, adjunct lager beer as a category, what a consumer would have experienced in the 1870s and 1910s and 1930s and during the war and right up to the American light lager has evolved. But it's fair to say that, looking at the first Pilsner, 1870s, certainly, there was it was the foam in those products was strong for a reason, because they were typically using more materials per barrel. It was a heavier beer, higher real extract. Alcohol was marginally at first slightly higher than today, but in the years prior to Prohibition, pretty much it had set on the alcohol levels that we have today. So the beer then would have looked a little darker in the glass. It would have had a beautiful head on the top of the glass, things you wouldn't associate with a Coors Light or Bud Light by any means today. So it definitely has evolved, and part of it was consumer driven. Part of it was, the years before Prohibition, in an effort to hey, this is a beverage of moderation. So that's sort of alcohol level we have today was really, really becoming standardized in the United States then.
What are some of the myths associated with American lager? And I think you have quite a list of them if you've put in the book, right?
I paraphrase them as the 5W Kool-Aid. And it's all based on, sort of drinking the Kool-Aid if you believe what you read on the internet is exclusively true. But the myths, starting with the when, we talked about that. There's a common myth that the use of adjuncts started during World War II when malt was hard to get. And clearly, in 1862, the United States government to help fund the Civil War, required every brewer in the United States to record for the $1 beer tax the amount of materials used per pound, per brew, per day, per year. We get, one thing the Treasury Department's good at it.
I think we're still doing that, aren't we?
We are. It's to this day, but that started in 1862. It was a significant percentage of the funding for the Union forces during the Civil War. So we have all this data, and you look and you compare. It really didn't change much between the 1890s, and I have a table for the amounts annual in 1896 and 1940 before the war, the year before Pearl Harbor, and they're virtually the same percentage in terms of ratio of malt adjunct. So the when is clearly that myth is it started World War II. Kind of debunked that in the book. The where, we've talked about that. Germany, the where says it started here. It's America's stigma and stain, if you will, on the beer world. But, well, the Deutsch have the dibs on that in terms of evolution of that. And maybe not even the Deutsch, but, the Czech, because, Balling himself, sort of synonymous with home and craft and macro brewers. I mean, he was experimenting with potatoes in the brewing of lager beer in the mid 19th century. So that was debunked. The what, there's often a belief that American lager beer before Prohibition bore no resemblance to the beer that is modern today. That it was mostly a world of continuing to be ales, porters, and stouts, and that it was not the beer of adjunct lager beer. So we talk about that. The who, and that's a big one. The who question is, well, why? Why and who? So the other two W's, right? Who drove this? Was it the consumers, or was it the brewers? As many posts say, it was sort of a greedy exploitation of the use in rice and corn during the malt to continue it after the war, to keep it, to maximize profits and blah, 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 blah. But when you go back, and again, we have all this in their own words and in the testimonies and the transcripts, 1870s, 1880s, it was a more expensive beer to make adjunct lager beer compared to all malt beer. And they talk about it. And they charge more for saloons. And so at the genesis, during those vital years when it was first developed for quite a time, it was more expensive on an extract basis and process, cookers and things like that, from a brewer's perspective. And they made it abundantly clear that it was the consumers who were take this all malt beer back from the saloons, and these are their quotes. It won't sell. Give us they called it the pilsner, but it was the adjunct lager pilsner of the time. So so that's a big. Whereas there's a fairly detailed academic study, the shipper versus local, that the shippers, the Budweisers, the Paps, and the Schlitzes and the big brewers, drove across the nation the use of adjunct lager beer with local communities in a perfect world, brewing only all malt beers for their local constituents. Well, that ain't true, because you look at, I've went through every journal, every page, because they always wrote about who was installing what in technology in what town in America and what brewery, and it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, approaching 1,000 brewers just between the 1880s and 1910s that were installing cookers. And, it's just in smallest communities. It was a pretty standard. The generic American brew house was pretty well set by the 1880s on. And an integral part of that for the vast majority were the integration of cookers for the brewing of adjunct lager beer.
And another interesting fact you mentioned was America is arguably the inventor of ice cold beer, right?
Yeah, I don't know if you've heard of a guy or come across whose name was. Have you heard of the Wall Hennius School in Chicago?
I have not, but
yeah, it was. Have you heard of Siebel's?
Of course, yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's basically Siebel was a competitor in Chicago of Wall Hennius, of the Wall Hennius Brewing School.
Interesting.
And something like 70% of the brewmasters were trained there in the last decades of the 19th century and of Prohibition. Including, the families of the Carlsberg and Heineken families sent their kids over to the United States to learn how to brew adjunct lager beer.
Wow.
They were trained as brewers in the United States, things you wouldn't expect. But then, they're interviewed by the paper and newspapers, Chicago Tribune, and, it's pretty cool when you think of it. But where was I going?
We're talking about ice cold beer.
Yeah. Yeah, the guy, the Hennius, Dr. Max Hennius, Aquavit. He was the son of the distiller Aquavit in Denmark. He came over here to the United States, and when he wrote his biography, he described being struck as he came into New York Harbor. There were advertisements in abundance for remedies to deal with dyslexia, I think it was called, the adverse effects of drinking ice cold water. That there were all these posters and advertisements. This is pre, Statue of Liberty. But he was struck by the fact that this ice cold emphasis was an American thing. And it definitely was. It was deeply rooted. Beer didn't start it. Adjunct beer wasn't the reason, ice cold started in the United States. We had a penchant for it culturally. Maybe it was, particularly climate driven, being for much of the United States being hotter than many European countries. But ice cold was an American deal, and it carried on into beer.
That's interesting. Well, how did the American lager style evolve over time to become the style we have today? You mentioned it was nothing like what we drink today, really, in the 1840s.
Yeah, it definitely did have these periods of growth. American lager, the all malt, from the 1840s to 1870s was on a per capita relatively small, but Dunkel style, but it was mostly consumed within the German American community.
Right.
But from the 1870s right up to say 1910s, there's this explosive growth where it was Pilsner as a style. So as a style, Pilsner lager beer, rocked the lager industry in the United States. But in the decades leading up to Prohibition, many states implemented state level prohibition, right? So, there was a gradual lightening of the adjunct lager beer in those 2 decades before. So slightly lower alcohol content compared to the 1870s to 1890s adjunct. Then Prohibition, the near beer, the dark days. And then there's a fact, and I touch on this in volume 1, briefly talk about the period between 1933 and repeal with the start of World War One. World War II.
World War II.
That was a period of actually the highest extract and brewing materials per barrel of lager in the history of the United States.
Wow.
Even more than the 1870s. I call it kind of like brewers gone wild. And again, it all gets back to government statistics, right? You've got these numbers. So, you just sort of lay it out. Here's what it was in the 1870s, and here's what it was in 1933. And it's remarkable during that period with one of what I call consider the heaviest adjunct lager beer in terms of extract and body and the way that it would be perceived. As you would expect, 1933 beer took off, and then it stopped. It started to decline. I mean, and nowhere near the per capita levels it was pre-prohibition up until 1941. And then there was this period of forced lightness. I call it forced lightness because what the industry had to deal with during this time was, malt was essentially fixed at 100% of pre-World War II, pre-Pearl Harbor. And that just didn't change throughout the whole war. But what was really difficult to get was adjuncts, corn and rice. And that started a period between 48 and 1941, 48, where we were using adjuncts we didn't typically use: flake barley, raw barley, barley grits, Kaffir corn, Milo maize, I'm not sure how you say it, cassava, and potatoes, and you name it. And what happened during that period of forced, there was a 60% growth of the industry from 41 to 48. 60%.
In terms of volume, I think, right?
In terms of volume, yeah. I mean, it'd be like today, another 120 million barrels of beer being sold in the United States in 2029 or something like that. I mean, it was a phenomenal period of growth. And the beer, particularly in the middle years when it was exploding, was essentially a 50-50 malt adjunct lager beer, where everything preceding that was, in the 70s, or 60s, 70s kind of deal. And it's fascinating. I talk about this in the first volume. The brewers are going, well, why? Why? From their perspective, this was not the beer they wanted to make. And they returned right after the war, or 48, after we didn't have to feed the world. Not have to, but we chose to as a nation. I'm very proud of that, in terms of care, when restrictions on grain ended. And it came back. It came back, but it didn't quite come back to that. Remember that period between 33 and 41?
Yeah.
It was a little lighter. And then it just went in kind of on a per capita basis, a very relatively slow decline, still significant volume.
Mm-hmm.
But then the directed light by choice, the evolution of the modern American light lager, boom, took off. And only then did we get to pass the per capita and volume numbers pre-prohibition.
Wow.
And I call this the sort of the march to lightness. So to summarize your question in three words, Brad, march to lightness is the way that I describe the evolution from the 1840s right up to today. And now we're with the craft community getting into it. The lagers that I have, and every time I go and I get an opportunity to take a craft lager, I do. I'd say that beer is more akin to the 1870s to 1890s style of lager.
Interesting. Well, popularity of the beer, I would argue, particularly in the 1800s, was organically driven. But there's this perception that, kind of after Prohibition, that the big breweries kind of shoved it down our throat. Is that actually true or not?
Absolutely, it is not true.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
And I have a chapter. I have a chapter that it's called "Legacies Denied."
Mm-hmm.
Because I believe that the legacies of these individuals, this generation of German Americans who gave us beer as a national beverage, and specifically adjunct lager beer, their legacies are being denied by that paradigm. That it was forced down, that it was only the Bud Miller Coors and the big boys and Schlitz and all that. Nothing could be further from the truth. But as I start that chapter, I started with just one word: pointless. Period. I say it's kind of like I used to tell my kids when they were young. It's pointless to try to convince somebody otherwise. When they were trying to convince their father that I should do this, and I didn't want to, and I say, hey, it's pointless. This argument is over. And I know that's going to be probably one of the hardest paradigms to address. So that's where the heart and soul of the trilogy. Well, I'll leave it to the American people who hopefully read this trilogy to like the style of beer, make up their mind when they hear, and I use extensively the quotes and the words of the people of this time, why they made that style of beer, why they used adjuncts, what it meant to the country, what it meant to the style. And I'll leave it up to the Americans. For me, just to say to you today, that's absolutely false. I understand it's pointless. Most people will say, yeah, right, you spent your time there, blah, blah, blah. Well, read the history and read what they said and just feel the history, because that's the emphasis of these books. It's really about their journeys as Americans, their legacies, and their legacies that have really carried over to the second American beer revolution, which is the craft revolution.
Pre-Prohibition, were we brewing a wide variety of styles, or were we still primarily brewing lager?
Yeah, it was lager, but within the lager, they were more diverse. You could still get Dortmunder and Kolsch, and you could still see relatively small percentages of those styles of beers brewed largely for German American communities. So there was a broader portfolio, if you will, at the time. And then, the ales and porters and stouts were still being brewed in Massachusetts and the Northeast. So it was definitely a more, I'd say it was fair to say that lager as a category was somewhere between 90 and 95% of all the beer sold in America going into Prohibition. And the vast majority of that was Pilsner style with adjuncts. But you could also still get Dortmunder, Peels in New York City, for example, but they used rice even in that. There were more styles available at the time. And that's a kind of a beautiful thing with the craft revolution, is it's reviving many of those other traditional German styles in addition to Pilsner.
And obviously the craft beer revolution has eaten into the traditional American lager share, at least. But what are some of the factors that really contributed to the rise of craft beer, starting, I think, in the 80s?
Boy, that's a really good question. And here I'll probably be, more tapping into my personal paradigms and my beliefs and I talk about this in one of the later volumes. I believe, but for the traumatic events of the 20th century. You had Prohibition, you had the First World War. And by the way, First World War, there was a period of like 6-7 months where Hoover demanded brewers only make all malt lager to save corn and rice for famine relief in Belgium, for example. Sorry, I'm diverging.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, so that's kind of a cool piece of history. But we
were talking about the factors that drove the craft beer revolution, really.
I speculate in July 1900, there was this young brewer who wrote to a guy by the name of Dr. Ernst Henke, who, like Siebels and Wallhenius, had a brewing school, a brewing station of research and education, training brewers. And a letter to the brewer, to this Dr. Henke in July 1900 said, how can a small brewer succeed in America, given by then the ubiquitous application of adjunct lager beer and brew house design and beer styles of the beer that was being sold in America? And he wrote back to this unnamed individual but small brewer who wanted to set up his brewery. He said, "I believe a beer of a different kind would flourish in the United States. Do not follow." He said, "Just because Montreal, the beer in the United States, is 3-4% adjunct lager beer,
Mm-hmm.
a good beer will always find different customers." And I believe, but for Prohibition, but for World War I, but for the Depression, but for World War II, we probably might have had a craft revolution, if you will. Again, this pure speculation. But because it was a start and stop, that it didn't have an opportunity to get legs. It just so happened the Greatest Generation, the beer that they grew up on after repeal and the end of Prohibition, was an adjunct lager beer. You get, and some of it, it's a hoot to read the transcripts. In Guadalcanal, guys are sending letters back saying, "Hey, this lager beer by this brewer is great," and the brewer saying, it was 20% cassava, for example, in it. So by the time that generation came, the blissful years of the 50s and 60s, I think it continued longer than it normally might have in terms of dominance. Because that was the beer they grew up on. That was their first beer. And it wasn't until their children, in the 70s and 80s, came of their own right. And I think that's a rite of passage for every generation to change things. I think that's why craft came in. That's why fatigue, if you will, but fatigue that's, in 1980s to 2020, that's almost a 40-year period, has only whittled away 20% of the overall market share. It's still got legs as a style, but the fatigue, I think, was a big factor. But I raised the point in the book, again, pure my opinion based on a career in the industry, but on that march to lightness I referred to earlier, we've lost since the 1980s. The domestic beer production has plummeted significantly for the first time. Other than Prohibition, all that kind of, we got imports, we've got craft. But I think, in terms of the industry, we've stopped brewing a lot more. We've stopped brewing a lot of beer since 1980s. And it makes sense. I mean, they're heavier beers to drink, right? But I talk in my this book about the march to lightness. I think we're already seeing evidence of it, even in the craft world, with the interest in lagers, the interest in hard seltzers, which is now a factor within the craft community, and the interest in non-alcoholic beers, lightness in terms of alcohol. So I think that march to lightness can still take legs and reverse that curve, and spur domestic growth, domestic production of fermented products like seltzers and lager beers that the craft brewers are also making.
Now, since you have some historical perspective, I wanted to get your opinion here on the dominance of IPAs in the craft beer industry. And it's well over 50% of the craft beer produced now is one style, arguably.
Yeah. In a way, it's kind of like the equivalent of the dominance of pilsner style lager amongst all the various categories of lagers prior to Prohibition and the decades after. I think that's that's the personification of, okay, we're not making a light drink of beer. This is our statement as a generation. We're going to revive. And even that though, I find parallels with the past, Brad. The IPA of the United States world is not the IPA of European IPA, right?
Right.
I mean,
it's clearly a unique style.
Yeah, it's in our DNA as a people, and they talk about that. Frederick Pabst wrote this book about the American brewing industry in the 1890s. He said, to the credit of the Americans, we mess with things. We just can't take status quo. And that's what we did with the adjunct pilsner of Germany, because it was born there, but the style and the way that it evolved was clearly American. I see the same thing happening with so many different styles in the craft world, where they're taking the old world, style and then, making it an American version of that. But I think to me, the fact that, IPAs, I don't know I haven't been following the statistics, Brad, but I suspect it's probably peaked, if not slight decline, as other styles are coming in. A little bit of fatigue, kind of like a parallel as the Pilsner evolved to be lighter. So too did, the juicy, the hazy IPA. I could, if I get I won't name names, but I always, typically will have an IPA as well as a craft lager. And of course, our son, his farmhouse ales, if they're available as well.
Well, I wanted to give you a minute here at the end to walk through your books. I think you have 3 volumes coming out at the moment, right?
Yeah, the first volume, the series title for all 3 volumes is The Inspiring History and Legacies of American Beer. And it might strike people as odd, the word inspiring, in terms of adjunct lager beer, because that's essentially what lager beer was in the United States up until the craft revolution. But it was a very deliberate choice. Because the history is a fascinating history, and I've broken it up into 3 volumes. The first volume covers the period 1941 to 48, and as an overall theme, I'd say that's about preserving that period. It was more about preserving the heritage, American heritage of adjunct lager beer through difficult times, but rewarded by massive explosive growth before it returned to where it was. Second volume is Born in Germany. That's the title, and it covers that overlapping period between the 1850s, when it's first started, as we talked earlier, in the German Empire. Right. Well, it wasn't the empire then, but in Germany up till 1906, and it covers that period and the profound influence. It's impossible to talk about the American journey of adjunct lager beer without assessing the German, because they were so intimately linked. And then the third, that's the one, particularly with the inspiring, and it covers the period in the decades leading up to Prohibition, the battle that was fought by the industry to protect the right of the American brewer to brew the materials of their choice. The irony of it being corn and rice, not grains of paradise or any other exotic spice or whatever that might be used today, but it was corn and rice contextually. The battles that they fought were inspiring to me, and that's when I talk about their legacies, not just succeeding in making beer a national beverage, but also protecting the rights. And every craft brewer, to me, and today, that is brewing with anything but malt, hops, water, and yeast, that's a legacy that needs to be appreciated, because the right to have that was almost lost, and it was literally, and I'll go through by each state, the federal, the Supreme Court, the media, the medical, everybody was saying, stop making this beer. And they were very public. They were very proactive. They were very passionate about their right to do that. And even, for example, Frederick Pabst, he sued the state of Missouri for a ban on corn as in his Pabst. And he couldn't even pass through the state of Missouri with it containing corn. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1902, the Supreme Court ruled for the state of Missouri, saying, yeah, they have the right to, it wasn't passed as a food safety measure. It was passed, again, follow the money, purely as a tax, an inspection tax, which was silly, because there's no way of proving chemically whether they use corn and rice. But it was just money, opportunity to build macadamized roads at the time. So roads for them and ships for the Kaiser. But so that's kind of the quick skinny, if you will. On so,
we actually, it was interesting though, you mentioned this earlier, but we actually came close to having an American Reinheitsgebot, right? Yeah,
it really started in the first real organized attempt was 1890, and that gets back to the very first part of this podcast about the Turner Adulteration Bill, which was introduced. Bills read in both the House and the Senate in terms of you shall only use these ingredients to make lager beer. And they were bills read, and I talk about this in the book. The only reason it was introduced as legislation, and this also is fascinating in the transcripts, who's losing money, right, when they're using adjuncts? The malting industry, which was a pretty powerful bloc. And they actually read into letters from lobbyists, DC attorneys, to the malting companies, and you give us this much money, we will agitate in the press and government to ban the use of these adjuncts. And when that got right into the transcripts, McKinley, who was then chair of the Senate Ways and Means Committee and future president assassinated in Buffalo, he said, well, this is commerce. This is a safety issue. So that was the first time, 1890s. But then it really was from 1890s right up to 1911. Mm-hmm. There was repeated efforts by congressional Pure Food Congress, the Food and Drug Act of 1906, in trying to standardize what could be used to make every type of food and beverage in the United States. And it culminated in 1911 with the What is Beer hearings in Washington, D.C. So we came really close, and it all overlapped, with that same period, but for different reasons. Germany, it was to get Kaiser enough funds with the reforms to the imperial tax law, where everything changed and it standardized to malt, but also dramatic increase in the same legislation for cigarettes and train tickets. And, it was built, Reichstag had this huge table of showing the models of the size of the German Empire's Navy compared to Great Britain and France and the United States. It was kind of like you had to, every legislator had to walk by it and get into the chamber. So, I'm going to rub some feathers, I'm sure, this book the wrong way in terms of myths and paradigms. But I'm going to let the history do the talking for itself and see what people think.
Well, Greg, just want to get your closing thoughts on the rich American lager beer history, which often gets ignored.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. I mean, really, it's my aspiration and hope that this trilogy, I'm not going to make a penny on a single book. And I'm just not. Everything that would be an author royalty, I'm going to be donating to taps.org. If you're interested, it's a group that really provides fantastic support for military families that have lost a parent. And we've had a lot of that with National Guard disproportionately involved in Afghanistan and Iraq. So anything that would go to me is going to that. So I'll just redirect it. So really, my hope is I find this history so inspiring. And at a time in the United States where perhaps history, the word inspiring might not be linked, whether I agree with that or disagree is moot, but it's clear that within society, I'm really passionate about telling a story of inspiration of a generation of immigrants that overcame incredible obstacles to have their imprint made on the American fabric, the American culture, the American industry, and now globally. So I'm hoping people, when they read this, because I know it's a history that's been forgotten completely. We're not typically the best in the world for understanding history, for example. Depressing how many didn't know if North or South Vietnam was an ally or foe when it's a 50-50 proposition. But nevertheless, we forget history pretty quickly in the United States. And I think this is a fascinating history. And it's a history that I think, if appreciated, will... I'm retired, but I believe it'll be a benefit to the entire American brewing industry, whether it's craft, macro, home, just to see, look at that glass of beer a little differently, whether it's a Bud Light because of the corn and rice or a Coors Light, or whether it's a craft beer that's using some exotic ingredients other than just the Fab Four, if you will, that'll spur growth in the industry. That'll be very positive for the industry that I have great passion for. And if the public sees beer differently than they do today, that once all these stories are out, and hopefully a documentary will follow the books, it gives a visual to it as well, that we'll see beer differently in society, and it'll be just a good thing for anybody that loves to brew beer in the United States of America.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Oh, it's awesome. Thanks for taking the time, Brad. I can't tell you how much I've been looking forward to this and how much I appreciate your interest in providing the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a closet historian, so I enjoy all of history, actually.
Yeah. That was always, even as a kid and all through my adult life. I've never read science, even though it was my thing. I've always read history. I've never read, different topics, particularly European history of the 19th and 20th century, because how profound of an influence that was in the world then and still today.
Well, again, my guest today was Dr. Greg Casey, former president of the ASBC and author of an upcoming, I think it's MBAA trilogy on American lagers, right?
Correct, yeah.
Thank you again, Greg. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Appreciate it. Have a good day.
Big thank you to Greg Casey for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. And also the Brew Commander, the new brewhouse controller from Blickman Engineering. It's available in electric and gas propane models. The patent-pending Brew Commander is a high-quality brewhouse controller that offers automated step mashing, boil timers, precision temperature control, and advanced settings. Command your brew day with a new Brew Commander. To order yours today, visit blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's blickmanengineering.com. And finally, the BeerSmith web-based version is out now at beersmithrecipes.com. BeerSmith for the web lets you build, edit, and brew recipes from any browser, including your desktop, tablet, or mobile device. You can try BeerSmith Web for 30 days by setting up an account at beersmithrecipes.com. If you purchase a Gold, Platinum, or Pro license, you get both BeerSmith Web and the desktop version for one low price. Check out BeerSmithRecipes.com to give BeerSmith Web a try. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.